As we are now approaching the end of the semester, we are going to start to discuss some of the things that could lead to relationship deterioration and de-escalation, including relational transgressions. So this is one aspect that researchers have identified as being part of the dark side of interpersonal communication, right? So focusing specifically on things we do in relationships that hurt other people. So researchers have kind of long divided interpersonal communication into the dark side and the bright side. And the dark side includes things like relational transgressions, some aspects of conflict, and then there are other things that we aren't going to talk about this semester, like enacting revenge against another person, right? So those are all things that kind of fall under the dark side. But this information on relational transgressions can also be found in chapter 13 of your textbook. As we begin this discussion about hurting other people and hurtful communication, I want you to first think about a recent situation in which you actually experienced hurt feelings. So a situation where you felt that something somebody did to you, really hurt your feelings or made you feel bad or sad in some way. So thinking about that situation, was that a situation that involved a romantic partner? Was it a friend who hurt you? Was it a family member? Was it an acquaintance or was it a stranger? So, in thinking about that, my guess is that you probably identified the situation as involving one of those first three, right? I mean, we can certainly get our feelings hurt by all different kinds of people, including people we don't know very well or we're not very close to. But one of the reasons to discuss this side of interpersonal communication is because when you do experience emotional pain or when someone hurts your feelings, it's usually someone who is close to you, right? So these are the people that we share the strongest connections with, and therefore they are also the ones that can hurt us the most in other ways that other people cannot hurt us, right? So my guess is that you probably identified a recent experience with hurt feelings as involving one of these three individuals, someone you're romantically involved with, or a friend or a family member. Part of the reason that the people closest to us can hurt us so deeply is because their messages, whether they be words or actions, communicate devaluation, right? And that's actually when our most intense feelings occur. So, devaluation is when you feel unappreciated and unimportant. And you can be devalued at the individual level or at the relational level. So, at the individual level, maybe you lost your job recently, as many people have experience with. But your friend or family member says to you, you know what, I'm really not surprised you lost your job because, quite honestly, you're not very hardworking, right? And that makes you feel unappreciated as an individual, right? As an individual kind of contributor to the workforce or that particular occupation. At the relational level, this would be a situation where your partner doesn't perceive the relationship to be as close, as important, or as valuable as you would like. So, quite literally, this could be somebody saying, I don't love you anymore. And that's a pretty direct, explicit way of communicating that the other person is no longer feels the way that you do. But something maybe less explicitly stated rather, is when a partner cheats on you, right? So cheating basically communicates, maybe not verbally, but that the other person doesn't value the relationship to the extent that you do. And that makes you feel as though you're not important and the relationship is not as important to them as it is to you. There are two primary behaviors that are especially likely to cause hurt feelings. So the first are relational transgressions. And relational transgressions occur when people violate implicit or explicit relational rules. So most of us have rules about infidelity, for example, right? So we expect our partners, our romantic partners, to be sexually and emotionally faithful. We expect them to be loyal, and we expect them to be honest, right? We probably also have expectations about betrayals, right? If a friend, a close friend, betrays you in some way, you probably are less likely to accept them, to trust them, and to respect them. We probably, have rules about flirting with other people while we're in an exclusive relationship, keeping certain kinds of secrets from certain individuals, physical violence, right? Generally speaking, we have rules about physical violence in a relationship, whether that's a romantic relationship or a different kind of relationship, right? The question really is, are these rules, are these expectations always explicitly stated? And I'm willing to bet that probably not. Right, so certain relationships might actually have explicit rules. So I'm thinking, for example, friends with benefits relationships. Those folks may have to be more explicit about the certain types of communication and behaviors they engage in and where, because because they're often trying to prevent the relationship from becoming any more intimate or close than they want it to, right? And there's actually a pretty famous episode of Seinfeld, if any of you are fans of that program, where Jerry and Elaine decide to have sort of this sexual relationship that's not romantic, but so they lay out some ground rules. So, no, there's no end of the evening kiss. They don't have to sleep over afterwards. You don't have to call the next day, right? All those kinds of things that are meant to keep the relationship from becoming more emotionally close. And what ends up happening is those rules are very quickly violated. So some relationships might actually people in them might sit down and discuss these rules that they have. Family relationships, right? Relationships between parent and children, especially regarding respect, might be explicitly stated. Or a relationship may have experienced an event that led to the establishment of an explicit rule, right? So situations maybe where you didn't realize you needed a rule until something happened that then made you think, well, we should have this rule, right? So some people, for example, have a rule in their households that nobody goes to bed angry. So in other words, if we're having a conflict, we're going to kind of stay up and hash it out and resolve it before anybody goes to bed upset. So that might be a more explicit rule that you have in your relationship or among your family members. So generally speaking, though, relational transgressions are when people violate these relational rules, whether they're implicit or explicit. There are three characteristics of transgressions that are worth discussing. So, first of all, transgressions can range in severity. So, not calling someone back or not spending enough time together are relatively low on the kind of severity continuum, so to speak, right? Those aren't often going to cause like irreparable harm in a relationship or anything like that. We can usually kind of work those things out. But lying, cheating, damaging someone's reputation are certainly more severe and then therefore likely probably to cause more harm to the relationship. Another characteristic is that transgressions can be understood differently by each partner, right? So, in other words, people don't always agree on what constitutes a transgression in the first place. So, if my best friend, for example, knows that I don't like this other person, just for example, but then she goes and she hangs out with that person, is that a transgression against me? Right? Because like, has she violated some kind of rule in our relationship, explicitly stated or not? Another one that often comes up, right? Can friends date each other's exes, right? So if we'll just say when I was in high school, if I had a boyfriend and then we broke up, and then I had a friend who then dated that individual, you know, is my friend breaking a relational rule between friends? And then finally, relational transgressions certainly they don't always have to, but they can cause irreparable harm to the relationship. And so that's an important point of discussion. So we're going to talk about some of these things as we continue on with this discussion. So, a few research studies have examined kind of what constitutes or what people identify as being their top transgressions. And as you know, we tend to do a lot of research on college students in the United States specifically, who are white and heterosexual. So, take this with a grain of salt. But the top transgressions among college students have been identified as having sex with someone else, wanting to or actually dating other people, and deceiving others about something significant. So often what I'll do is I'll ask students, which one of these would cause the most harm in your relationship, assuming the behavior only occurs one time. So in other words, maybe it occurs one time, but you attempt at least to work through it afterwards. And I had always sort of assumed that the most common response would be having sex with someone else, and it certainly is commonly identified, but a lot of people also identify the other two, right? So some students have said deceiving me about something significant might imply that the other person is having sex with someone else, right? Or that they are secretly hoping to date other people. So in other words, the last transgression could encompass the other two, or at the very least make you suspicious that the other two could be happening. Others have said, wanting to or actually dating others is more significant because I'm more concerned about my partner establishing an emotional connection that might lead to a physical connection. Or some people just say, I'm honestly not that worried about a physical connection between two people. It's the emotional connection that matters more. And I would be less upset if I found out my partner had sex with someone than if they, actually fell in love with someone else. So these are all considerations. And I would also encourage you while you're listening to this to think about if there are other transgressions that you would add to this list. So is this list still relevant to college students, or have you all identified additional actions, behaviors that might rise to the top of this particular, or at least be added to this list? So think about if there's something missing from this particular list as times have changed and so on. So the first type of hurtful behaviors we discussed were relational transgressions. The second type are hurtful messages. So hurtful messages are essentially words that elicit psychological pain. And this is actually inconsistent with that saying that we all probably heard as a kid, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. This is inconsistent with that sort of idiom, right? Words actually can be hurtful and often more hurtful than sticks and stones, so to speak, or um, physical actions. So what we also know about hurtful messages is that they are based on perceptions, which means that messages perceived to be intentional are especially hurtful and especially damaging to relationships. When I have a personal example, if you'll humor me for just a minute, I was in grad schools, I think maybe my first year of grad school, second year maybe, and my sister was getting married, and I lived in Connecticut and she lived in Texas, and my family lived in Kentucky, and so we were heading there for Thanksgiving anyway. And so at the beginning of our Thanksgiving break, I was going to throw her a bachelorette party, and she wanted to have that bachelorette party in Nashville. And so I basically did my very best to plan this bachelorette party. I told all my family that we were doing it. They were actually sort of upset that, like, they sort of were saying that it was inconsiderate of her to, drag everybody all over the place. And instead of doing it someplace nearby where we were all going to be, we have to travel to Nashville. So anyway, being a grad student and throwing a bachelorette party and just being like generally busy and stressed and overwhelmed, I ended up getting pretty sick during that Thanksgiving break. And by the end of it, I was just absolutely run down. And my grandparents wanted to go shopping on the way to the airport to drop me off so that I could come back to Connecticut. And they wanted to go shopping because they wanted to pick out a present for my sister, but they wanted me to be there so that I could try it on for her so they could make sure that it would fit because she had already gone back to Texas by then. So I got up that morning and my grandmother asked, how are you feeling? And I said, not good. And my grandfather just, I don't know, lashed out. He called me selfish and inconsiderate, which was really hurtful because I felt like I'm sure he thought he was defending my grandmother, and that's perfectly fine, but I didn't mean anything by it. She asked me, I thought an innocent question, and I answered honestly, and he was really upset by that. And it was probably just, an amalgamation of various things, but, I felt so hurt by that because I just spent a weeks planning a bachelorette party for my sister and organizing everything and then still showing up for the family holiday and this and that. So yeah, so I felt like because it felt really intentional and targeted and directed. And it honestly probably wasn't looking back, but it hurt. And the fact that I still remember this was probably 10 years ago. The fact that I still remember it, just goes to show that these types of messages can actually be very hurtful. So, words can hurt you is really the point here. So there are many types of hurtful messages, of course, but there are 5 that come up most commonly. So evaluations are negative judgment about the worth, value, or quality of the partner or the relationship. So something like, this relationship has been a waste of my time, right? You're negatively evaluating the relationship, that it just wasn't worth your time to begin with. Or you might say, you're the most inconsiderate partner I've ever had. Accusations are claims about a person's fault or actions. So you're accusing somebody of something. So if you put all the blame on the other person, this is all your fault. We would never be in this situation to begin with if you hadn't flirted with that person at the bar on Saturday night, right? Or just saying, you're a selfish person. Those types of messages are accusations. Informative statements include disclosing unwanted information to the other person. So maybe you say, I only dated you because I was on the rebound. I never really cared for you. Or you say something like, I've never really trusted you. Directives are directions or commands that go against the other person's desires or imply negative thoughts or feelings. So if I say, don't call me anymore, pack up your stuff and go, I want you out of here by the time I get home tomorrow, right? Assuming my partner doesn't want to do those things, right? That my comments are going against that person's desires. And then expressions of desire would be statements about your preferences or desires, right? So you might say something like, I wish you were more like my ex. And that's probably not a very nice thing to say. So those are kind of the 5 most common types of hurtful messages. So let's take a look at a few specific types of transgressions and hurtful behaviors that occur in relationships. I'm going to talk through infidelity first, and then in part 2 of the lecture, we're going to talk about jealousy and deception. So some studies have found that infidelity is really kind of an especially hurtful event. It has a particularly strong negative effect on relationships and is often considered to be the least forgivable among a number of offenses, right? So most people in committed relationships in the United States highly value fidelity and sexual exclusivity. But some research has also found that method of discovery is particularly important. In other words, how you find out about the infidelity might influence your reaction to the infidelity or your likeliness to forgive your partner for the infidelity, right? So in which of these situations do you think you'd be least likely to forgive your partner versus most likely to forgive your partner? So we've got So you find out your partner's cheating from someone else. So someone else tells you that maybe they saw them doing something somewhere that where you were not. You might witness the infidelity firsthand, right? So you walk in on your partner cheating on you with another person. Perhaps your partner admits to the infidelity after being questioned, right? So you have some kind of suspicion that something's going on. You ask about it, and then they do finally admit to what's happening. Or the partner confesses without ever being asked. So when I ask this question in class, a lot of students will say that they're most likely to forgive their partner if the partner confesses without questioning, because that shows kind of a level of maturity, honesty, and um, regret, right? So they're kind of communicating that they've messed up, they did something wrong, they still value the relationship, and they want to work things out. And then a lot of students will also say that um, they're least likely to forgive and most likely to say their relationships were damaged if they found out from a third party or if they walked in on the infidelity happening and saw it firsthand. Which makes a lot of sense, of course. You find out from another person that your partner's cheating. That's a very embarrassing, face-threatening situation, of course. And then certainly walking in and seeing it with your own eyes might hamper your ability to get over that. I've had a few students across different semesters though, and this always comes up and I want to mention it. So they said that they would be most likely to forgive the option that doesn't involve anyone else, even if that means walking in on it happening, because at least the infidelity is kept between the three people involved, and the person being cheated on can attempt to save face. Right? So, in other words, if you don't make me look stupid to all my friends and family and we can keep this between us, I might be likely to forgive you even if I walked in on you cheating in our shared home and saw it with my own eyes, right? So that's, I think, a consideration as well. So think about that. Think about what would be most detrimental to your relationship in terms of method of discovery. There are, shockingly, different types of infidelity. So, sexual infidelity is, of course, sexual activity with someone other than your long term partner. And cheating is actually more common than we might think, despite the fact that, especially in the United States, we value monogamy in our romantic relationships. So, some research has found that between 20 and 40% of dating and cohabiting couples experience at least one incident of infidelity. And that number drops a little bit for married couples, so 13 to 18%. So, it's actually not entirely unheard of. Um, it's a relatively large number. We can potentially argue the value that we place on monogamy and whether that's, I don't know, a good thing, a bad thing, or whatever. I think people have different opinions on that, but that's what the research says. And then the second type of infidelity is emotional infidelity. So basically, you know, giving your love and attention to someone else. This is emotional involvement with another person. This is essentially loving and confiding in another person, channeling your resources into another person. And so that could be hurtful as well. And then communicative infidelity is engaging in sexual activity with another person to communicate a message to the partner. So maybe you're cheating to get the partner's attention, right? Maybe you feel like you're being ignored or dismissed or overlooked in the relationship. And this is the way you get the attention that you've desired. Maybe you cheat to enact revenge for the person mistreating you in some way, or even to show that you're dissatisfied with the current status of the relationship. Some people would say that it's more acceptable and justifiable in some circumstances, right? So maybe your partner cheated on you at one point, so you decide to cheat on them to get back at them. But the question is this, do two wrongs make a right, so to speak, right? Is this acceptable or justifiable in that regard? So that's a question that often comes up in this discussion. There are, of course, various reasons that people cheat on their partners. The leading cause of sexual infidelity is being dissatisfied with the current relationship. Some other reasons are just being bored in the relationship, feeling like you need more excitement in your relationship, right? So maybe your relationship's kind of reached a standstill. Maybe those levels of passion have started to wane. We talked about Sternberg's love triangle, triangular theory of love, not love triangle, triangular theory of love earlier in the semester. When we talked about how passion fluctuates in a relationship, it fluctuates across time and in long-term relationships. So maybe boredom is something that leads to cheating. Maybe you cheat because you want to kind of boost your self esteem. You want to feel good. You want to feel attractive. You want to kind of make sure you still have it. Maybe you're experiencing sexual incompatibility with your partner, but you still love your partner. You care about them, but the sexual chemistry is something that's not quite there. Or again, maybe you're trying to send a message. So maybe you're trying to get revenge on your partner. If people are truly dissatisfied in a relationship, something that we know that happens is that they may turn to other people for support, and that leads to emotional infidelity. And oftentimes, emotional infidelity progresses into a sexual relationship. So, researchers have found that men and women react differently to sexual and emotional infidelity. But the question is, why is this true? Um, I'll just kind of issue a caveat here. I'm really not satisfied with either of the perspectives that we're getting ready to talk about, but they're covered in your textbook, and it's worth at least acknowledging since it is an important part of the research. But I want you to think through kind of any gaps in our understanding of why men and women might react differently, or even if they do react differently. All right, so anyway, most of the research regarding this question as to why do men and women react differently to infidelity, a lot of the research comes out of evolutionary psychology and suggests that men and women react differently to emotional versus sexual infidelity because they have different priorities related to reproduction. Now, recall the limitations of evolutionary theories. Evolutionary theories assume differences between men and women to be natural rather than learned, and evolutionary theories ignore the influence of culture. So, right there, we've got two big holes in this hypothesis, but we're going to continue this conversation. So, the evolutionary hypothesis basically predicts that men should get more upset over sexual infidelity because of paternal investment issues, right? So, in other words, women know that they're the parent of the child, but men, assuming, right, that the woman is carrying the child, but men could be uncertain about their paternity, right? So, if the woman had sex with someone else, then there is a level of uncertainty there. So, men would be more concerned if the woman has sex with another man who could potentially impregnate her because he's concerned about investing time, energy, and resources into potentially raising a child that's not his. The evolutionary hypothesis also predicts the flip side of that. So women should get more upset over emotional infidelity because they worry about protecting their most valuable resource, which is the relationship. And so the idea here is if her partner starts investing resources into another relationship, there won't be any left for this one. We're also assuming heterosexual relationship. So that's another kind of limitation of this particular hypothesis. So studies looking at physiological responses to people imagining their partners engaging in sexual activity with someone else or imagining the partner is in love with someone else have found that men show a greater physiological and psychological distress when imagining their partners are engaging in sexual infidelity And then the opposite is true for women. Other studies have asked men and women which would make them more upset, their partner having a one night stand or their partner falling in love with someone else, and those results are still pretty consistent. So that's the evolutionary hypothesis. That's the explanation provided as to why men and women might have different perspectives when it comes to emotional versus sexual infidelity. Other researchers have argued that reactions are better explained by the double shot hypothesis. So, the double shot hypothesis basically says that we all get upset about both types of infidelity. But if I ask you to choose which one upsets you more, you're likely to choose the one that suggests that the other is also happening. Okay, so this basically means that men will say they get more upset over sexual infidelity because they assume their female partners would not want to have sex with someone if she did not also love that person or feel emotionally connected to that person. In other words, if I find out you're having sex with someone, I'm also pretty sure you love him. Women choose emotional infidelity because they believe their partners are likely to have sex with a woman that they also love or are emotionally attached to. So if I find out you're in love with another woman, I'm pretty sure you're also having sex with her. People who have studied this hypothesis have said that these differences only arise in a forced choice format, right? So in other words, I have to basically say, is it emotional infidelity or is it sexual infidelity? Which one is more upsetting to you? So there are limitations to both of these perspectives, like I said. So I don't necessarily agree wholeheartedly with either one of them. So you should, as students and potentially researchers in interpersonal communication, should think about this and think about, what information we might not have or what information would challenge these particular assumptions put forth by these two hypotheses. There is a video on Husky CT, and it's relatively lengthy. It's about 9 or 10 minutes, and it's from a few years ago when Steve Harvey wrote a book about infidelity. And I like to show it in class more just for the conversational aspect than anything else. So if you want to give it a watch, please do. But I do want to just be super clear that I don't condone any of the comments being made in the video about men or about women. A lot of them focus specifically on men. At one point, I believe he says that it's essentially within men's DNA to cheat, which I certainly don't agree with. But I want you to watch it because I think it's important to sometimes, even when we're studying interpersonal communication, to stop and take a look at the messages from the media, from other sources, right? Cultural messages about love and relationships and what's expected from the people in those relationships, because I think that helps us kind of figure out or helps us understand why we hold some of the opinions and the values that we do. And it's important that we think about those messages and we critique them. And that's what I would like for you to do. So I don't want you to just watch and passively accept the things being put forth in the video. To guide this kind of critical thought process, just a few questions, right? Do you agree with the statement that he makes, once a cheater, always a cheater? Do you think it's in men's DNA to cheat, which he also claims? And importantly, do you think Steve Harvey is a good source of information and advice on this topic? Just spoiler alert, I do not, but perhaps you have a different opinion. Okay, finally, we should talk about, so one of the things that Steve Harvey also talks about are, like, basically, are there ways to spot a cheater? Are there ways to determine if your partner is cheating on you? And while I wouldn't necessarily go by everything that he says, some of what he says does overlap with responses from college students in different research studies. So, in other words, research has identified behavioral cues that trigger suspicion about infidelity. So, some signs of sexual infidelity. Most of these were behaviors that triggered suspicion. Most of the behaviors that triggered suspicion were related to observable changes in the partner's sexual behavior, right? So maybe they've picked up a few new moves, right? Things that you've never noticed before, and you're kind of like, I wonder where they learned that, right? Where did that come from? Some other things would be indirect physical signs, right? So smelling someone's perfume or cologne, or something else on your partner's clothing. Direct revelations, right? So either you catch the person cheating or they confess to you. Changes in sexual behavior, so acting differently during sex in one way or another. Exaggerated affection, right? This would be like maybe being overly affectionate and overly supportive and buying gifts and presents and things like that for your partner because you feel guilty for what you're doing. And then kind of opposite in changes in sexual behavior or even exaggerated in affection would be sexual disinterest. So they become disinterested in having sex with you because they're having sex elsewhere. Some signs of emotional infidelity. Most of the behaviors that triggered suspicion here were opposite of the ones people use to maintain their relationships, right? So, for example, emotional disengagement. This is emotional distancing. These are behaviors that are basically attempting to prevent the relationship from becoming more intimate, right? Decreasing that intimacy. Passive rejection. Maybe your partner becomes more inconsiderate or inattentive. Negative communication. So maybe your partner is uncharacteristically angry or argumentative. Perhaps your partner is reluctant to spend time with you. So they start to separate their social network. There's less time one-on-one, those types of things. Reluctance to talk about a specific person might be a clue. So if they avoid all conversations about somebody that they're working with when previously that was open for discussion, that might be a clue. And then guilty communication, right? So they act like they're doing something wrong. I skipped over relationship dissatisfaction and I didn't mean to, but if your partner is acting like they're unhappy or dissatisfied in the relationship, then certainly that's a pretty general but good cue that things are amiss in the relationship. And then there are signs of both types of infidelity, sexual and emotional infidelity. So apathetic communication, so the partner starts putting less effort into the relationship, and that could be a sign that they're investing their resources into a different relationship, or they're having sex with someone else, or increased contact with a third party. So again, spending more time and attention on another person. So that's the end of part 1 of this lecture. So part 2, we're going to explore jealousy and deception as 2 additional types of relational transgressions.